Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to completely shift our lens on the deadliest conflict in human history. When we normally think about World War II, our minds immediately go straight to those legendary generals, the massive tank divisions, and sweeping battlefield maps. But today, we're turning away from the front line. We are going to look at the everyday people. We're going to examine the war through the experiences of the civilians living on the home front, because honestly, their story is the true, untold engine of the entire global conflict.
Okay, let's dive right into this. There's a shocking truth about how we perceive war versus the reality of World War II. When we imagine war casualties, we almost always picture soldiers, right? But the data tells a totally different story. Between 67 and 80% of all direct and indirect deaths from the war were civilians. The vast majority of people who lost their lives in this global conflict were absolutely not wearing a uniform.
60 to 75 million people. I really just want to give that stark number a moment of breathing room so we can process it. That's the estimated total death toll of World War II. When you factor in the percentages we were just talking about, it means that upwards of 50 to 60 million ordinary men, women, and children perished.
So, that brings us to a really critical hook for our explainer today. In the deadliest conflict in history, who actually bore the brunt of the war? The answer to that question changes how we fundamentally understand the 1930s and 40s. The traditional front line was effectively erased. The battlefield was everywhere, and the combatants were, quite literally, everyone.
Section 1. The production powerhouses.
To understand exactly why civilians became targets, we have to look at the concept of total war, where citizens were transformed into the primary drivers of the military machine, and there was a stark contrast in how the two major coalitions mobilized their populations. The Allies recognized early on that they needed everyone, bringing massive numbers of women into the industrial workforce, which allowed them to dramatically outproduce their enemies. The Axis powers, particularly Germany and Japan, showed a deep reluctance to employ women in factories. Instead, they made a really late shift to a war economy and heavily relied on the forced labor of millions of enslaved people, just to keep their industries running.
Now, the United States, safely separated from the bombing raids by two huge oceans, became what was famously called the arsenal of democracy. By producing roughly two-thirds of all Allied munitions, we're talking warships, warplanes, tanks, and ammunition, the U.S. industrial workforce essentially outsupplied the Axis powers. Because its home front was an untouched production powerhouse, the U.S. emerged from the conflict vastly richer than any other nation, completely dominating the global economy.
Section 2. Cities under the bombs.
Because civilian production was the absolute lifeblood of the military, strategy drastically shifted. Consider this incredibly chilling bureaucratic term, dehousing. This wasn't just collateral damage, This was a deliberate strategic bombing goal aimed at destroying the homes of the civilian population. I want you to just imagine your own hometown suddenly becoming a legitimate military target, simply because the people living there support the national economy.
The Allied strategy explicitly aimed to, quote, disrupt the war economy, reduce morale, and dehouse the civilian population. This official doctrine effectively erased the line between a combatant holding a rifle and a civilian sleeping in their bed.
And this strategic doctrine quickly became a physical, devastating reality in the form of massive aerial campaigns launched by all sides. In China, Japanese aircraft struck cities in the Sichuan Basin, killing tens of thousands of civilians. In Europe, the Allies launched the massive firebombing of Hamburg, inflicting severe casualties to destroy the industrial center. And in the Pacific, a single incendiary firestorm attack on Tokyo killed upwards of 100,000 people and left 1 million civilians homeless literally overnight.
Section 3. Occupation and forced labor.
For millions of civilians, the war wasn't just about bombs falling from the sky. It was the daily, brutal reality of living under foreign occupation and massive human exploitation. 69.5 billion Reichsmarks? That is the staggering sum of wealth that Germany plundered from occupied Western, Northern, and Central Europe by the end of the war. That accounted for over 40% of the total income Germany collected from taxation as the war progressed. Entire national economies were systematically stripped to feed the occupying military machine.
And this brilliantly illustrates the human cost of all that economic exploitation. 7.6 million. That was the number of foreign workers and prisoners of war forced into labor within Greater Germany by late 1944. Human beings were treated as just another raw material to be extracted and consumed.
These grim exploitation systems operated on a massive global scale. In Germany, there were 500,000 slave laborers suffering in concentration camps.
Japan conscripted millions of foreign civilians across Asia for forced labor and forced up to 200,000 Korean and Chinese women into sexual slavery. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union imprisoned, deported, and exploited hundreds of thousands of civilians and POWs from occupied territories in their vast Gulag forced labor camps. This exploitation was truly a global phenomenon.
Section 4. The ultimate human toll.
We're going to transition now to the final and, frankly, darkest reality of the home front experience. At least 20 million people died from deprivation, famine, and disease. While countries like the United States experienced an incredible economic and population boom post-war, huge swaths of the global population, from the Soviet Union to China to India, experienced mass starvation resulting directly from wartime policies and resource diversion.
The conflict also provided the cover for systematic, deliberate civilian extermination. The facts documented in the source material really just speak for themselves here. The Holocaust, perpetrated by Nazi Germany, resulted in the murder of 6 million Jews along with millions of Slavs, Romani, and people with disabilities. In the Nanking Massacre, Japanese forces killed between 40,000 and 200,000 Chinese civilians and POWs. In Eastern Europe, about 100,000 Poles were killed by the Ukrainian Insurgent Army in the Volhynia massacres.
In North China, the Japanese military implemented the 3 alls policy. The official directive was quite simply to kill all, burn all, loot all. This was a massive scorched earth initiative deliberately designed to completely depopulate regions deemed hostile to their occupation.
Perhaps the most tragic realization is that for these civilians, the suffering didn't instantly end the moment the treaties were signed. The immediate aftermath in 1945 saw mass rapes with civilians committed by occupation forces across Germany and Asia. Between 1945 and 1948, Europe faced severe economic stagnation due to policies of industrial disarmament. And tragically, hundreds of thousands of repatriated Soviet civilians, finally freed from German camps, were immediately sent straight to the Soviet gulags under suspicion of collaboration.
So, we want to leave you with this final provocative thought. By turning civilians into the engine of war, total war turned them into its primary victims. When factories, homes, and citizens themselves become the primary targets, does the battlefield ever truly end? The treaties of 1945 ended the military campaigns, but the civilian experience of World War II fundamentally altered the world, leaving scars that shaped the entire 20th century. Thank you so much for joining us for this explainer, and we really encourage you to keep learning and reflecting on the true cost of history.